places to do some terribly important and very serious work. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce, and please join me in welcoming Maria Maclennan.
Thank you very much, Sean. What an introduction. No pressure at all then. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Maria, and today I'm going to tell you a story. Now, stories, like design, are all around us. Every single one of us has our own unique story to tell. And stories too, like design, are inevitable. We cannot avoid telling stories. We tell them whether we mean to or not. And we as human beings are fundamentally narcissistic creatures. We love to tell stories about ourselves. But often we don't just tell these stories using dialogue. Often, inanimate objects can speak too, and sometimes they speak in volumes. Stories can be told in many ways, incorporating each and all of our 5 senses. But in fact, we don't even need a mouth to tell a story. What we wear and how we choose to communicate our identities inherently exemplifies something about who we are as individuals, or at the very least, the sort of person we would like to be. We may choose to be more subtle about such decoration, like me. Or we might choose to be more deliberate in our attempts to individualise our appearance. So, you're all here today to hear a story about something called forensic jewellery. And as any good designer should, I'm going to start that story with a question. And that question is, what is forensic jewellery? And again, as any good designer should, it is first important to be A, upfront, and B, honest. So in that spirit, I have a bit of a confession to make. And that is that the field of forensic jewellery doesn't actually exist. Yet. You see, I am a jeweller, I am a designer. I have no forensic, no policing, and no scientific background whatsoever. Feels pretty good to get that off my chest, actually. But one thing that we do best as designers is dream, is imagine, ideate, and innovate. We're also really good at nicking other people's stuff from other disciplines, ideas, experiences, conversations, and approaches, and reappropriating, reframing, and reworking those into something which is apparently new. When we're young, we draw, we make stuff, we play, we experiment. Ultimately, we take risks, and because of that, we're more creative. And then we grow up. We become adults. We get a real job, and a mortgage, and a toaster, and ultimately we stop being so creative and so free. And those dreams, those ideas, become nothing more than that. And what design allows us to do is tap into that inner child and utilise fiction, perhaps, or impossibility, and utilise crazy, imaginative ideas and filter those down into realistic, practical, usable solutions. Think of the technology that we see all around us in films, such as Minority Report or The Fifth Element, television programmes such as CSI. Now, whilst the forensic science that we see in things such as CSI might not be the reality of forensic science today, there is nothing to suggest that these ideas, these crazy fictional concepts, cannot at the very least inspire the forensic science of the future. This is what forensic jewellery is. It's an idea. It's a theory. It's a concept. It is an exploration into the possibilities and the plausibilities of jewellery and of design more generally, and what that might contribute to the field of forensic science. More generally, it is about exploring how two seemingly very disparate and very opposing fields can come together and exchange knowledge. In recent years, we have looked to broaden our forensic horizons to include more creative methods such as forensic art, forensic photography, forensic textile science, forensic sculpture and facial reconstruction, even tattoos, piercings and body modifications as identifiers. So why not jewellery? Now, design allows us to ask that question where science might not. Design not only allows us to ask why, but why not? So, as part of my current PhD research at Duncan of Jordanston College of Art and Design, here at the University of Dundee, I set about on a very unique journey of discovery, from jewellery designer to forensic jeweller, to explore what a jeweller and a designer might have to contribute to a field such as forensic science. Now, identity is a notion which has fascinated jewellers for centuries, and something that we have to consider every day in our work. Why do we wear jewellery? Jewellery is one of the oldest forms and key indicators of identity, and ironically, the act of crafting and wearing a piece of jewellery is a science far older than the science of, say, DNA. Archaeologists have for decades been digging up iconic artefacts that continually push back the first known date of when our ancestors began to participate in a culture that we would know and recognise. The earliest known jewellery recovered dates to approximately 100,000 years ago, and similar items are being recovered all over the world every day. The likelihood is that all of us in this very room are wearing or in possession of something that is unique and specific only to us. A family heirloom or bespoke piece, an adjustment, alteration or prescription perhaps that is made unique and specific for our needs. And that is one advantage of jewellery over and above our other items of personal effects. Jewellery has an inherently symbolic nature. It has connection to both place and geographic region. It has personal, religious and cultural significance. In fact, in terms of identification statistics, jewellery enjoys similar success levels to our blood group and radiography. Jewellery can also be physically strong strong, as well as more innately representative of identity. The general durability and robusticity of items means that certain metals may well survive the more extreme disaster environments, such as the temperatures of fire, the degradation of burial, and submergence in water, whereby textiles and other fabrics may be prone to disintegration after a prolonged period of time. There is no item that exemplifies the proverbial notion of diamonds are forever better than this 14-carat white gold diamond brooch, which is also known as the 9/11 brooch. Now, this brooch was recovered from one of the safety deposit boxes in the aftermath of 9/11, the majority of whose contents was reduced to ash. The diamonds present in the brooch were actually recovered in next to the same condition as when they were valued prior to 9/11, serving as a poignant reminder of a diamond's true nature. Physical markings such as hallmarks, serial numbers, engravings or inscriptions can also provide us with a lot of information about who the item may have originally belonged to, useful in tracing an item's origins perhaps back to the point of purchase, often even therefore the purchaser themselves, in addition to determining a piece's timeline or movements across continents. As a jeweller myself, I have my own unique hallmark that is unique and specific only to me that I apply to my work. Serial numbers are also present on higher end and more expensive pieces. Watches in particular, particularly companies such as Rolex, Cartier, Chopard and Tiffany, all apply a unique serial number, usually under the 6 o'clock mark on a watch's dial, which can be traced every time an item is brought in for servicing and repairs. This was the case in the infamous Ronald Platt homicide investigation, whereby a Rolex wristwatch led to the identification of an, at the time, unidentified body that was recovered from the English Channel. With no other clues in the case at that time, collaboration was initiated between Rolex and the investigating team, which eventually led to the Rolex wristwatch identifying Mr. Ronald Joseph Platt, and eventually leading to the conviction of his murderer, who was actually on Interpol's most wanted list at the time. The authorities were additionally able to determine the date and time of death within a very small margin of error due to the date on the watch's calendar. A significant proportion of diamonds are also laser engraved or marked at a microscopic level, a code which is otherwise unbeknown or undetectable to the human eye and nigh on impossible to change or remove. Diamonds in particular, too, have a great affinity to collect and harbour skin cells such as DNA, which can often solidify and calcify around a stone setting to such an extent that they become almost as hard as the diamond itself, requiring to be burned off. The likelihood of obtaining a swab or a sample from this matter is therefore generally relatively good. Even in its absence, the presence of jewellery may still be detectable through the targeted use of UV or ultraviolet photography. This was the case in the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, whereby UV photography was utilised in order to take advantage of the increased absorption of UV light that some of the victims' skin had been exposed to. Although now absent, either through the tsunami itself or the deliberate removal of jewellery on the part of the Thai locals, it was still possible to detect some items of jewellery, such as watches or neck chain, and where they may have been worn due to the block in UV light that these items had created. New technologies are also infiltrating the fields of both forensic science and jewellery design. Just like a human fingerprint, every gemstone has a unique gem print, which is unique and specific only to that gem. This can be recorded through firing a high-powered microscopic laser through the gem, which casts this beautiful sparkle pattern or gem print. So what are some of the stories then that jewellery can tell us about an individual? Well, there are two main ways in which jewellery is recovered with a body. So we have associated items. Those are items recovered on or with a person, or items that may be otherwise linked to us that might have our name, such as our wallet, photographs, bank cards. There are also unassociated items, items which are recovered independently or removed from the body. However, jewellery in particular is interchangeable and also collectible between individuals. Therefore, we have to be particularly careful that just because an item of jewellery is recovered with a person, that it actually belongs to and is actually associated to that person. For example, the image on the left illustrates some religious insignia, probably from a pendant or neck chain that was actually recovered inside the dentures of an individual. The image on the right illustrates a radiograph taken in the aftermath of 9/11, which actually shows an amputated hand, complete with finger ring, that was recovered inside the thoracic or chestal cavity of a completely different individual. Another issue with jewellery is, although less so than other items, its ability to deform in both shape and appearance post-mortem or after death. As you can see, this might have particular implications on the way an item is described, in that what may have ante-mortem or before death been a yellow metal wedding ring may now resemble an entirely different aesthetic and be described as a red or brown metal hoop, perhaps. But jewellery may also provide us with other vital clues surrounding the circumstances of an investigation. This was the case in the Ipswich serial murders, which are more commonly referred to in the press as the Suffolk Strangler homicides. These 5 women, all of whom worked in the sex trade, were recovered naked, bar their jewellery. Detectives noted that this action may have been a deliberate action on the part of killer Stephen Wright in order to notify the authorities that each of these homicides were linked. And similarly, the preciousness of something as inherently personal as jewellery can also be really cruelly manipulated and twisted into that of a trophy kept aside from a homicide or killing. In 2009, detectives trying to establish whether Scottish serial killer and repeat sex offender Peter Tobin was responsible for more than the 3 killings that he was convicted of, released the images of these 32 pieces of jewellery to the public in the hope that they may be able to identify them. None of these items were ever claimed by any of Tobin's 3 ex-wives, which led to the authorities believing the items had been kept aside as trophies from some of Tobin's other victims. Specific and highly personal items of jewellery which are worn perhaps every day and mean something to an individual, and therefore otherwise should be present upon their body post-mortem, are often found to have been removed. And that can sometimes be indicative of a more sinister undertone. In 2009, in the Melanie Hall murder investigation, Melanie's killer, or killers, clearly with some forensic knowledge, removed all of her clothing and her jewellery, bar this one ring, which just so happened to be a treasured heirloom given to Melanie by her grandmother. Now, what can this action tell us about the psychology or the mentality of the killer or the killers, or the relationship perhaps between Melanie and her killer? Arlene Fraser vanished from her home in Elgin in Scotland more than 13 years ago. More than a week after her disappearance, her 3 gold rings mysteriously reappeared on a small wooden rail in her bathroom, and eventually became the cornerstone in the prosecution against her accused husband, Nat Fraser. It was suggested at the trial in 2014 that Nat had deliberately replaced or placed these items in the family home in order to create the sense that his wife had been due to walk away and leave him. Now, this notion of profiling a killer or a victim or a circumstance surrounding jewellery is already somewhat of a popular notion in the field of forensic art. This is an example of a 2-dimensional or flat reconstruction done after death or post-mortem by forensic artist Lois Gibson. The victim's remains were recovered in a very heavily decomposed state where a reconstruction otherwise wouldn't be attempted. However, due to the really distinctive jewellery recovered along with the victim's remains, this drawing was actually able, when released to the public, to identify the victim due to the recognition of the really distinctive jewellery recovered, even with next to no facial features depicted. So, this all sounds relatively promising, right? Wrong? It would certainly appear that jewellery does have the potential to be a useful method of identification in a number of forensic capacities. But what if an item isn't handmade? What if it isn't particularly personal? What if it's a mass-produced item, indistinguishable from hundreds of thousands of others? What if it isn't considerably expensive? Imagine trying to sort through all of the rings recovered in the aftermath of the Holocaust, searching for a way to identify each, reunite each with the families of victims, perhaps. Unfortunately, this is a scenario that's not all uncommon in the aftermath of a more contemporary disaster. Where we may have once had cultural or geographic diversity through jewellery, we are now losing in our mass-produced society focused on consumption and consumerism. The ever unsustainable Primark, Topshop generation of high street fashion stores brings into question how can we possibly differentiate between what is one item of jewellery as opposed to 100 others. Although the jewellery that we wear and the items that we possess do have the potential to inform investigators a lot about us as individuals, It is the subjectivity through which we interpret that identity which determines what we think we are able to glean about an individual. In reality, there are as many different opinions of us based on the way we look as there are people. Visual recognition is by no means an infallible method of identification, and in fact, profiling somebody based on the way they look and how they dress can be a very dangerous thing indeed. Can you imagine some of the assumptions people might make about me on a daily basis based on the way I dress, my personal effects, my jewellery? In fact, would you look at me on a daily basis and see someone that works with the police, a PhD researcher, multiple degrees, a university lecturer? Funnily enough, I've never had anybody rush up to me in the street and recognise all of that based solely on my appearance. Quite the opposite, in fact. So, is forensic jewellery a viable and worthwhile field of practice? Is there a need to have such a thing as forensic jewellers? To test this proposition fully, I have had to effectively become my own research hypothesis. I have had to become a forensic jeweller. So, the past 5 years of my professional practice as a designer have actually been spent engaged within the realm of forensic science, exploring what not only a jeweller, but a designer and design in general can contribute to this field. I retrained in the field of disaster response. I deployed overseas in 2013 and spent a month working overseas in a South African police mortuary in response to the LAM Mozambique aviation crash. In March of last year, I spent a month working in Namibia in response to the Germanwings incident, in addition to 8 weeks back in the UK processing all of the personal effects, including jewellery, from the same incident, in addition to the very tragic acts in Tunisia. In 2011, I worked with the Centre for Anatomy and Human Identification, also at the University of Dundee, to prototype a classification system for jewellery, which could be used to help describe and classify items of jewellery on an international level after disasters, in the hope that more matches between items could be made, so that we could perhaps not only identify the victim themselves, but return some of those items to families. In 2013, I spent 6 months seconded to the National College of Policing and Home Office, researching the role of service design in facilitating a knowledge exchange between design, the police and academia. And finally, in October of last year, I was awarded a fellowship to work at the Library of Congress in Washington, DC, researching the importance of jewellery recovered in the aftermath of 9/11. And I was also very fortunate to be able to visit the Holocaust Memorial Museum and the 9/11 Memorial Museum in New York City, both of which, very sadly, of course, feature jewellery prominently in their collections. So, what of the future of forensic jewellery? Well, forensic art has taken the principles that underpin art and applied them in a forensic context. If we didn't have forensic art, we wouldn't have the reconstructions of Richard III, we wouldn't have the age progressions of Madeleine McCann. So, what would we get if we took the field of forensic textile science, but explored that using the methods, approach and perspective of a textile designer? What if we took forensic jewellery and explored that from a scientific rather than a design-led perspective? Science cannot wholly quantify an individual because our identity is not a quantifiable entity. The reality is there is no foolproof means of identification because our identities are all-encompassing. However, if we can continue to build and hone the sort of techniques at our forensic disposal, then that can surely only be a good thing. Collaboration and knowledge exchange are key to good ideas, and we are witness to fantastic examples of that all around us at this very design festival. The increased range of areas where designers are applying their skills here in Dundee and also further afield include prosthesis, community engagement, positive mental health and well-being, our criminal justice system, better care homes in the future, and of course forensic science. Designers are not only telling stories, but we are creating them. We are not only solving problems, but we are identifying opportunities to solve problems before they even exist. So, as any good designer should, I answer my own question and I end my own story by raising yet another question. And that is, Dundee Design Festival, what is your story? What do your objects and the things that you carry with you on a daily basis tell about you? Thank you very much for listening.
Mine's blown, I think. I wonder if anyone like me, from the get-go with that, was kind of just looking down to your hands or around your neck, thinking about what you're wearing, and whether also, well, I wonder how many people are here wearing jewellery right now? Hands up, please. Most people, I would say. And I wonder how many people did think down to some of those objects or ornaments around their necks or their hands or elsewhere, might help identify them in a crisis. Can you put your hands up if you have that kind of thought as well? Yeah, I mean, it's an extraordinary thing. And I think the future director of the next Dundee Design Festival as well, I think, piecing all these stories together, and that's exactly kind of what we've been trying to do, I think, with the exhibits and some of the talks we've had here, is tell these stories. So either by offering your own story or eliciting a little bit more from Maria. I wonder if anyone has a question.
Hello.
Hi, Graham.
Yeah. I was wanting to ask you about the work that you did with CAHIT, about the identification or the system that you were working on. And I wanted to ask, what was it that came out of it, the classification system, and what were some of the kind of issues that caused the classification system to be created in the first place?
Yeah, sure, great question. So I originally studied jewellery design at the art school, and then I did a master's in service design, and I worked collaboratively between the art school and the Centre for Anatomy, and we were working on an external project brief on behalf of Interpol and 5 other worldwide project partners. One of the problems currently, when I talked about the way jewellery is described, family liaison officers and police officers will sit down with the families of missing persons thought to have been involved in a disaster, and they will be asked to describe everything about their loved one, from the way they look to what their jewellery was like. And those descriptions are input on something called Interpol's Disaster Victim Identification Forms. Similarly, post-mortem, we have forensic examiners at a scene or a disaster or a crime who will be filling in a similar set of forms, but they will have items which have obviously been recovered in a completely different way. They might be broken, burned, they might be missing a stone. It might not even be recognisable that they were a ring or an earring. In the same way, bodies, jewellery, everything kind of perishes and changes. So when these descriptions come together, they are run through a kind of traffic light database almost, where we have a green, it's an identification, an amber, it's a possible identification, or a red, they don't match. Unfortunately, there are lots of ways in why they don't match, and a lot of that is down to language. Even in terms of kind of language that we use every day, in the UK we call trousers trousers, in America they're pants. Pants mean something different in America, etc. We also have translation issues, whereby Interpol they subscribe to English, Arabic, German and French. So we have words that don't even translate in the same way. We have subjectivity, whereby what I say is brown or green or a ring or an earring, somebody else might not. So there are a whole host of ways in why these items might not match, but potentially they may be a match. So the system that we designed tried to, in some ways, force or encourage people down a particular route to describe jewellery in a particular way by giving them specific examples, boxes they could tick, and kind of further classify jewellery down to kind of a description that was more universal. But also encourage them to still be more detailed in that description. So we designed a system that accompanied people when they filled out these Interpol forms, which was a prototype, really. So that was trialled with police officers worldwide, but unfortunately Interpol's forms themselves, due to Interpol's sort of subscription to 190 member states, it's very difficult to get the actual forms changed in any way.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Anyone else got a question?
Hello.
Hi, Gavin.
Wow. Didn't realise how loud this was. Okay, in the past 10 years, there's been an expansion of crimes being solved that were crimes that had occurred decades ago, such as wrongful convictions. Do you see an expansion in forensic science being able to delve more into that, into solving crimes from, say, decades ago?
Specifically through jewellery, or just in
Yes,
general?
with an involvement.
Yeah. I think there are always new techniques and new technologies that are arising that allow us to revisit cold cases, as we would call them, and that perhaps we didn't have the foresight or the hindsight and the technologies to look at the time. So they've been otherwise shelved or may need to be revisited. I think jewellery in cold cases, especially in America, is actually very common, especially where skeletal remains are recovered, whereby we might not have a missing persons report, may never have been filed. We might not therefore have a database to check what we call primary methods, such as dental records or fingerprints or DNA for comparison. Textiles and clothing, again, as I say, may have sort of worn away or disintegrated, so we're left with skeletal remains and jewellery. So certainly I think jewellery is something that can, along with our skeleton, withstand a period of time. So I think it definitely has the potential, through techniques that we continue to develop, to be able to identify not only jewellery, but our skeleton and the other circumstances surrounding a crime can hopefully only continue to improve. Yeah.
Anything else pressing? I was just going to ask also, because you started to say that you come from a jewellery background. I wonder, as a designer, how your research over the last few years has now informed the way that you make jewellery. You talked about how designers often deal with a problem to find a solution, but sometimes we actually anticipate a problem. So has that gone into your thinking when you're making your jewellery now?
Absolutely. I mean, in terms of my own identity, ironically, I call myself a jeweller, and I can't remember the last time I made any jewellery, and that's really funny because I think if the wonderful Kate Pickering of Vanilla Ink and Scottish Jewellery Week here in the audience, who I think would be inclined to agree, we have so many jewellers these days that actually maybe don't make so much jewellery anymore, and designers in general who are making less in terms of objects, and it's more about the ideas and the process and the kind of problem-solving approach that we take. So I think my practice as a jeweller is I'm still sort of actively practicing jewellery design, just maybe not in a sort of crafts-based making kind of hands-on way. So my practice is very, very different, and certainly, you know, my thinking in terms of jewellery has been opened up to the way that jewellery and the human body in terms of identity connects is in a completely different way. So I think, again, that can only be a good thing, and I think that designers and students of design looking at their practice and the possibilities can hopefully see the possibilities of their practice beyond, you know, the workbench or the studio in front of them. Yeah.
Well, I think on this point, also if you're not tired of forensic science and you want a little bit more, also kind of intrigued by the way that people in Dundee specifically are kind of leaping across disciplines really wonderfully, then come back at 3:15 where Niamh Nick-Dade will be talking about her experience with Dave Coss, a firefighter from Derby, who are setting a design challenge as part of the Dundee Design Festival to redesign smoke alarms to wake up children, which is also an extraordinary case of collaboration. But before that, can you please join me in thanking the wonderful Maria Maclennan?
Thank you very much. Thank you.